President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Today, perhaps not unexpectedly, he revived the idea of joint armed forces for the European Union, which could comprise 3 million soldiers and serve as a barrier precisely against the advance and aggression of the Russian Federation. He stated this while speaking with journalists. It's very interesting what Volodymyr Zelensky said a year ago. He had already voiced this idea publicly at the summit of European leaders and made the proposal, and he did so in the spirit that Ukraine, as one of the most militarized, if not the most militarized country on the European continent, could become the foundation around which other armed forces could be united. And thus, everyone could delegate a certain type of troops or technical equipment, weapons, formations, armed units, ground forces, and so on. And 3 million would be enough to deter the Russians. A year has passed, says Zelensky, and I say it frankly, not a single step has been taken towards this idea by anyone. Maybe now, because of all these challenges, the leaders of Europe will give it some thought. Zelensky emphasized that the European armed forces would not mean competing with NATO or undermining it. It's just that Europe should have its own separate, strong army. Europe, says Zelensky, is a separate continent that should have its own unified army. Ukraine, without a doubt, can become one of the fundamental contributors to strengthening such an army. This is not just about the army, but also about sharing technologies. We have wartime experience and we share our technologies with our partners. Honestly, without our experience, during the war, some countries wouldn't even know how their weapons actually work. They are able to improve them thanks to our processes and engineers, added Volodymyr Zelensky. And here another story immediately comes to mind. This is a publication that appeared 2 days ago in Politico. I have already mentioned it in my other reviews. What does Politico write about? Politics writes that the idea of these joint armed forces could unexpectedly be realized because of Trump's actions regarding Greenland. NATO, the main idea of NATO, which is now bursting at the seams because NATO is experiencing a crisis, an ideological crisis, a crisis of philosophy, a crisis of unity, if you will. One NATO member wants to annex another NATO member. A paradox that just doesn't fit in your head right now. And obviously, something needs to be done about this. And someone wants to do something. For example, right now in Davos, Mark Rutte is expecting a meeting with Donald Trump. He said that regarding the security situation in Greenland and the Arctic, we will continue to work on this. I am looking forward to meeting him, that is Donald Trump, in Davos later this week. Rutte, as secretary, wants to steer things now, but obviously this is a very complicated story. And so in parallel, something like this is emerging. Here is the idea proposed by Zelensky. It could materialize, only it will not be called the European army. And Ukraine will not become the epicenter or the core or the base for this European army. Ukraine can only become one part of this military alliance. And its backbone, its ideological content and substance will actually be taken on by Ukraine's partners within the coalition of the willing. So oddly enough, that's the case too. Many people worry that the coalition of the willing is rather weak. This formation, this creation is even weaker than Ramstein, which was initiated by Biden. Nevertheless, look, diplomats commented for the politician without naming names, but the coalition of the willing has been dealing with Ukraine's issues from the very beginning. Everyone acknowledges this, right? But it created very close ties between some key people in European capitals. They strengthened trust and, in fact, the ability to cooperate. These capitals and their representatives know each other by name, and it's easy for them to get in touch and send messages to one another. Politico says that potentially the format, a coalition of the willing, could become the foundation for a new security alliance in an era when the United States no longer supports NATO and European security. The new agreement does not exclude cooperation with America, but it also does not assume that it will happen automatically. And America will not be central. That is, NATO may continue to exist, and this is in parallel. It is very similar to what Zelensky is proposing and reminds Europeans of. But you see, the leading role, after all, if Europeans do create something like this, the leading role, they still don't want to give it to Ukraine. Well, it is a deeply rooted and long-standing tradition. I do not quite know how to put it, but it is the ancient tradition of old Europe, whereas Eastern Europe is often viewed as being like some kind of younger brothers who are still finding their way. These nations still have to find a way to overcome many significant and difficult obstacles, including widespread poverty, high levels of unemployment, systemic corruption, and even the devastating reality of ongoing war. That's the essence of it. Macron, by the way, today, I don't think he specifically meant a joint European army, but Macron, as a representative of a great nation, the French, today in Davos, acknowledges that the world has changed and that all of us in Europe are entering a new era into, if you like, some kind of period, I don't know, of turbulence. And in fact, let's listen to what he said. It's just that here, the only thing to note is that he's wearing glasses. That's due to some health issues with his eye. Macron says, we're entering a world without rules. The US, he says, is trying to weaken Europe and is demanding more and more concessions from Europe. In response, Europe must defend itself. And there are mechanisms in place to avoid threats to trade and international stability. Macron is now trying to project the image of a European leader like Tom Cruise from Top Gun. He appeared wearing those sunglasses. He could have worn different glasses, but he chose exactly those, the kind police officers or pilots in American action movies wear. And he says, yes, the world must become safe and Europe must defend itself. Overlay all this with the Politico publication about the coalition of the willing, with today's comment from Volodymyr Zelensky about joint armed forces and a single army of 3 million soldiers, and you get the full picture. The continent of Europe is currently developing a comprehensive Plan B. And this alternative Plan B, it doesn't seem to be fully ready yet. The Russians, who weren't invited, really don't like it.
Take a look at the situation occurring just on the very eve of the diplomatic meeting taking place in Alaska, and we still sincerely hope that this understanding will continue to fully retain its original strength and validity. Although we can clearly observe the manner in which, almost hysterically and with increasing desperation, the nations of Europe and President Zelensky, along with his entire leadership team, are relentlessly trying to push the United States government off its current established position on this matter.
Here they're saying that everything Europe does is bad. But Trump is great. He wants to annex territory for the sake of the United States security. The same thing is being done by the Russian Federation. It annexes territories for the security of the Russian Federation. It annexes the territories of independent states. And I also want to remind you of another story. This is the story about Budanov and Ukrainian intelligence. On December 20th, 2025, not so long ago, just a month ago, Budanov expressed the opinion that Putin is preparing an invasion of the Baltic countries for 2027. This is a serious matter. An invasion of the Baltic countries. Why? Because he can. Because if something goes along the lines of the United States, according to Trump's philosophy, in a way that's favorable to him, regarding Greenland, next will be Canada. And here it will be the Baltics. And to prevent this, we need to act. That's what this year's Davos is about. That's what it's about. That's what Zelensky's comment is about. That's what Macron's comment is about. The United States, at least for the next 3 years, in the future, is stepping away from the role of the world's policeman. They're stepping away. And Europe somehow has to deal with Russia.